Te Deum laudamus, Te Dominum confitemur, Te eternum Patrem, omnis terra veneratur, Tibi omnes angeli, Tibi celi et universe potestates, Tibi cherubim et seraphim, incessabili voce proclamat, Sanctus, 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 Dominus Deus Sabaoth, pleni sunt celi et terra, majestatis gloriae Tue. Te gloriosus, apostolorum chorus, Te prophetarum, laudabilis numerus, Te martyrum candidatus, laudat exercitus, Te per orbem terrarum, sancta confitetur ecclesia, Patrem, immense majestatis, venerandum Tuum verum, net unicum Filium, sanctum quoque Paraclitum Spiritum, Tu Rex gloriae Christe, Tu Patris sempiternus es Filius, Tu ad liberandum susceturus homine, non uruisti virginis uterum, Tu debito mortis acoleum, naperuisti credentibus regna celorum, Tu desterande sedes, in gloria Patris, iudes crederis, esse venturus, Te ergo quae sumus Tuis famulis obeni, quos precioso sanguine redemisti, net eterna fac, cum sanctis Tuis in gloria numerari, salvum fac populum Tuum, Domine, net benedicere hereditati Tue, net regemus, net extole illos usque in aeternum, per singulos dies benedicimus Te, net laudamus nomen Tuum in saeculum, net in saeculum saeculi. Dignare Domine isto, sine peccato nos custodire. Miserere nostri Domine, miserere nostri. Fiat misericordia Tua, Domine, super nos, quem ad modum speravimus in te. In te, Domine, speravi, non confunda in eterno. Benedicamus Patrem et Filium cum Sancto Spiritum. Laudemus et super exaltemus eum in saecula. Benedictus es Domine in firmamento caeli, nel laudabilis et gloriosus et super exaltatus in saecula. Domine exaudi orationem meam, nel clamor meus a te veniat. Oremus. Deus cuius misericordiae non est numerus et bonitatis infinitus est thesaurus, Pissime maiestati Tue procolatis donis gratias agimus Tuam semper clementiam exorantes. Not cui petentibus postulata concedis, eos de non deserens ad premia futura disponas. Per Christum Dominum nostrum. Amen.
Salvete vos! Hello, everyone. I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute, an institute for the humanities, an alternative college and high school here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this broadcast is to dive into the City of God by St. Augustine. This presentation is part of our Medieval Beginning series that we're hosting this autumn semester. As I get everything squared away, the hymn that you heard for the past 6 minutes was not an accidental or random choice. Rather, the hymn is the Te Deum Laudamus, which in the Western Church is sung on every feast day, which would of course include every single Sunday. The Te Deum Laudamus, not chosen at random. The legend of this piece is that it was penned by St. Augustine and St. Ambrose on the night of his baptism. So we're looking at our author today, Aurelius Augustinus, and I thought it would be appropriate to begin with that familiar hymn from the Liturgia Ararum. Again, it's sung every Sunday and every other feast day of the year. Incidentally, as we are speaking English, that Latin hymn in the 19th century was adapted, and we know that English adaptation as Holy God, we praise thy name. Holy God, we praise thy name, etc., etc. And a beautiful adaptation and extrapolation it is. It goes on, in fact, for something like 15 or 20 stanzas, though very few of those are printed in missals. Okay. Or, excuse me, hymnals or missalettes, a wretched American invention, the missalette. Anyway, we have bigger fish to fry, so let me keep my crankiness in wraps. And we're actually coming to the end of the liturgical year, so you're about to see tens and hundreds of thousands of missalettes chucked out the doors of all of your Catholic churches in these United States very shortly. A massive waste of money for a church which is very good at wasting money. Anyway, what about that crankiness? The image we had kicking things off is of an illuminated manuscript, which I'm told is from a copy of the Civitas Dei, the City of God, which is our focus for today. I have actually seen leaves from the City of God, medieval manuscript leaves from these old books, very old books, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I believe. And you get the impression that they're much bigger than they are to see an image that's across the screen here. I was actually surprised how small they were, maybe 6 or 7 inches by 5 or 6 inches. Not large indeed, but it makes sense if you consider the restraints of copying. You want to copy in as most economical a way as you can. In fact, that's why Bibles have those columns very often. It's a way of literally fitting as much text as possible onto the page. So yes, this is an illustrated manuscript, and we're looking at medieval beginning. So let's indeed start at the beginning. The premise of this series over the next 4 weeks is to pick away at this question. When does the ancient world begin and the medieval start? And what you're enjoying here is an opening presentation for a subsequent discussion which will be had. If you go to our open events page, you can see some of the other installments in this series. So please God, any one of the 4 coming sessions are going to be beneficial in and of themselves. However, they do form a certain series which will be mutually enriching. So it would be great to have you join, not just to take in the introductory remarks, but to join us for our chit chat afterwards. I keep saying this, and I'm not going to stop saying it, that going forward, most schools are going away rather soon. The only schools that will continue into the future are those that are going to offer what schools can uniquely offer and cannot be provided for with machines or with hirelings. And part of that is discussion with real live people and a learning journey in common. They will offer you in a short time AI education. And almost everyone, pagan, Christian, and Jew, old man and young, is going to go in for it. You are going to see the mainstream and the alternative education worlds hollow out faster than you can say lickety-split, whatever. Most of the herd has no conception of knowledge beyond its utilitarian capitalistic end. Well, let them go. May their chains sit lightly. Those of us who continue in this noble occupation, either as teachers or students, and those are interchangeable designations, as anyone who's been around a school and had a good school experience will know. Those of us who hang out and hang on will be the ones who offer what schools can uniquely offer, and that is partially in-person learning. Secondarily, appropriate to our open events series, is also scaffolding of knowledge in things like series and in meta ways larger than this as well. Scaffolding knowledge. You and I have infinite knowledge, nearly infinite knowledge at our fingertips. Certainly more knowledge, more books, more podcasts than we could ever listen to in our lives. It's not strictly speaking infinite. That would be a divine quality, but it is effectively or practically infinite because the volume of material to review one time, let alone in any serious depth, actually well outpaces a human lifespan at this hour, and it's easily accessible, not only in our public libraries and on our radios, but also, of course, on the internet, our telephones, which can access the internet. Infinite knowledge. That's not education. Schools going forward are going to be able to present themselves, the ones that survive, with what they can offer uniquely, which in addition to interpersonal wrestling with the knowledge is also scaffolding knowledge, scaffolding information. The internet, all your libraries, etc., they can provide you with data, and thanks be to God for that, but they cannot scaffold knowledge. That's what schools are for. That's what scholars are for. To scaffold, or that is to say, to arrange knowledge in a comprehensible whole. Machines cannot do that. And autodidactism is going to have a hell of a time doing that as well, incidentally. Most people do well with teachers. Okay, Anyway, a good way to dip your toes into the wild world of Apocatastasis is to indeed join in on our open events. If you're already enrolled in any of our classes, these are free. If you're not, there's a slight donation we ask for to help grow the Institute. And with that, let's carry on here. Want to check the tech, and of course we're going to need some good old background music, so why don't we get that squared away. I do have Roman-ish music from a video game. Shall we? Well, we shall, but not this loud. All right. We are looking at the end, maybe, of the Roman Empire with St. Augustine and the start of the medieval world. So the purpose of this is to indeed look at that question: when does the classical world, or the ancient world as you like, when does that end and the medieval world begin? These are just preliminary talks to discussions hereafter. So we have a good summary sort of essay here, and then some ancillary things. The text itself, which we'll nibble at. It's a large tome. You know, we probably are familiar with St. Augustine, if we're familiar with him, from his Confessions, which is really the first autobiography in human history. And again, regardless of whether Augustine wins the title of being the first medieval man, he certainly is a genius in any way that you chop that up. He's the inventor, as I say, of the autobiography. And, you know, it's not for nothing that in the medieval period that Augustine's Confessions and his City of God, which again is not a short tome at all, were thought worthy enough to replicate. I would say in the medieval age, only after the Holy Bible was, you know, we would say that only after the Holy Bible, the next biggest publication, so to speak, would be Augustine's Confessions and City of God, the Civitas Dei. Well, there must be something worthwhile to hand copy these manuscripts, these illustrated manuscripts. When you see these sorts of letters, right, and you see the frizzle frazzle around it, that we call these illustrated manuscripts. And Augustine looms large over not just the medieval period and medieval Christianity, but modern Christianity as well. Probably more than anyone except for St. Paul. Has St. Augustine influenced Western Christianity? So regardless of whether he takes the trophy for being the first medieval, he is certainly influential in the Catholic Liturgia Orarum already referenced in regards to the Te Deum. Augustine is read, I've not really crunched it literally, but I feel confident, I would put a bet on it. Certainly if you were to average it, he's read twice or thrice a week during the office of readings, sometimes for very extensive stretches. For instance, in September, there's a lengthy sermon on pastors, which parallels the reading of Ezekiel, or more lately, his letter to Proba on religious life and on the Our Father and on the prayer life as well. So he was an outstanding intellect, regardless of religious confession, an outstanding intellect, and one, unlike many people from history, who left a lot of writings preserved, which is most interesting given the circumstances of his times. And this is appropriate to our question of Augustine, the first medieval, the last classical man. Augustine's writing and living in the 4th century of the Christian era, when the barbarians are invading North Africa. Here we have a very colorful digital illustration of a Visigoth, a Northern European, a Scandinavian. A lot of people believe the Visigoths originated in Scandinavia. Well, eventually they they kept going through Germany into what we call France, down through modern Spain, and into North Africa. And so you see this very confused African fella coming across this hairy beast from Northern Europe. But this is what Augustine was living through. Literally, he dies with the Visigoth army sieging his see. See is Christianese for the city where a bishop administrates from. So here is the Roman Empire in Augustine's day. I wonder if I can blow this up. Oh, of course not. Anyway, I dare not play around with the magnifying feature, but you can see the Mediterranean basin, and then you see two colors for the Roman Empire. You have this purple color and this more reddish color, and the colors designate the Western red and Eastern purple empires. And these are at this point a unified Roman Empire that was broken up because it was easier to administrate in this fashion. Diocletian, of course, had done a massive overhaul of the administrative structure of Rome in the generation prior to Augustine, which explains this. And of course, this is interesting because Christianity will split almost perfectly along east-west lines that you see here between the Western Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox. That's not particularly appropriate to us, but what is, okay, we're going to have to try our luck with the zoom feature. Perhaps we'll live to regret it, perhaps not. All right, we can make do with this, but Augustine is here. If you see my cursor, there's this area, Hippo Regius, not far from Novo Carthago, the rebuilt city of Carthage. Carthage had been destroyed in the 3rd century BC, 600 years before Augustine, which gives you some idea of the footprint of the Roman Empire, which is interesting because, of course, Carthage was destroyed at the same time that Corinth was destroyed in Greece. The Roman Senate was sending a message to the Greeks and to the Phoenicians, or the Phoenicians, or the Carthaginians, as you like. And in time, both of those cities were rebuilt with Roman colonists. It's interesting, of course, that, well, maybe not Carthage, but Hippo Regius, so we associate with Augustine, this massive figure in Western Christianity. And when I say Western Christianity in this context, I am not just referring to Catholicism, Latin Catholicism, but also Protestantism. Historical, we'll say traditional Protestantism, makes very, very heavy use of Augustine, maybe too much use of Augustine, or maybe a certain overemphasis. Maybe I'm speaking out of turn as a historian to use that judgmental language, but it's not a matter of conjecture that Augustine is I would say par excellence, after St. Paul, the Protestant theologian, when he considers grace and the certain directions that fellows like Luther and Calvin took Augustine in later times. And as I say, in Latin Catholicism, Augustine is a titanic figure, more lukewarmly received in Eastern Orthodoxy, but nevertheless a titanic figure intellectually. The point is, though, Augustine is writing, and this is really what sparks the city of God. He's writing at a time that the Western Empire is falling apart. This looks very pat, doesn't it? It looks very stable. You know, these colors, it looks very compact. But in reality, the Western Empire was farmed out to all sorts of barbarian tribes, which were officially Roman, which could give you the justification for this sort of a map, but wasn't. These were mercenaries, basically, hirelings. The Roman Empire in the West, in particular, had really been eaten out in terms of its, especially its elan. And this is what Augustine was up against. The reality that Christianity in the Roman Empire had suffered tremendously for hundreds of years, and then it ultimately converts, gets on the good side of the cops with Constantine, and there's a few hiccups after the fact with the likes of Julian the Apostate, but all of a sudden the quote-unquote true religion is accepted by the Imperium, and now it appears that the Imperium's falling apart. And it's not just the Western Empire that has to deal with the likes of the Visigoths, but in the East, if you can notice here, you have the Sassanids, the Persians. It won't be until much time after Augustine that the Sassanids are taken care of by Islam. But in any case, in the Eastern Byzantine Empire, as we call it, there's a slog, a 700-year war that is happening between the Eastern Romans and the Persians. So things aren't altogether chipper here in the East. So Augustine has to deal with that. There are still plenty of so-called pagans about in the Roman Empire, although a certain tipping point had been reached throughout the empire. So now that Christianity is cool to belong to, now every Tom, Dick, and Harry wants to get on the wagon, which causes all sorts of problems. Augustine is living at this same time. Not only does he have to, in the city of God, provide a Christian apologetic for what the hell is happening, the empire finally converts, and the so-called true religion has apparently messed the bed. I mean, shouldn't the true God of the true religion protect the empire? Well, what's happening? This is the nut that Augustine has to crack. He has to explain to the Romans, Roman Christians and Roman pagans, how this religion and more importantly, how this God is operating in this time of dissolution, apparent dissolution. And indeed, it's not just this external front that Augustine has to deal with, but internal problems the Christians came across post-Constantine or post-Nicaea, as the case may be. And that is the problem of so-called heresy, deviations from what the majority church considers orthodoxy. And that brings us to, in fact, the person that Augustine dedicates the Civitas Dei to. And, of course, when we're mentioning Augustine or the Civitas Dei, we have the benefit of hindsight. We know that Augustine is going to be an influential figure for the next 1700 and counting years, especially in Catholicism and Protestantism. He looms over the West. And so do subsequent echoes of what Augustine's up against, not just political dissolution, but also internal Christian theological controversies, which never end, apparently, even into our own day. And all of this is to say that the Civitas Dei is dedicated to a fellow called Marcellinus of Carthage. And Marcellinus, subsequently, is a Christian saint and is held by that group to be a martyr. I believe his feast day is recorded in the Roman Martyrology, which we sing at the end of Lauds these days, or formerly amidst Prime. The Roman Martyrology. And Marcellinus, the dedicee of the City of God, was a friend of St. Augustine's. So here's a book that's going to have such resonance for centuries after that monks will copy it by hand. Well, the man that it's dedicated to ought to be a good and worthy figure. And long story short, Marcellinus was a bureaucrat, a very high up bureaucrat. I think they refer to him in this little article as Secretary of State. Well, that's a high office, isn't it? That's nothing to sneeze at. Secretary of State. That's the highest diplomat in the Western Roman Empire, certainly in the modern American Roman Empire, certainly a high up post. And we read here that Marcellinus was in this office under Honorius. Honorius, of course, Tennyson reminds us in St. Telemachus, Honorius is the emperor who at last, finally forbids the gladiatorial games. And that poem is a great poem, by the way, St. Telemachus, indeed. But whether it's Telemachus or St. Augustine or St. Marcellinus, you do have this very interesting time in the 4th century where, you're almost a foot in both worlds, which is the whole purpose of this series, between the pagan classical and the medieval Christian. And so with Augustine, you have the external writing of the city of God, and then the internal point, and this is going to be appropriate to Marcellinus, the internal divisions amongst the Christians in Augustine's neighborhood and just throughout the Christian world. So you have this external, internal reality. And then to buttress this point of the vitality of the age, you have with Honorius, right? I mean, you still have the barbaric gladiatorial games still going on. And it's, as Tennyson reminds us in the poem, artistically, it's Christians attending those games. It takes someone like Telemachus to jump into the arena to shake everyone up about this dual life that has to end. Anyway, what happened during the persecutions prior to St. Augustine's life? So we're looking at the 3rd century, the 260s, 270s, 280s, is you have the Dacian persecutions after a period of peace. And what this spawns in North Africa is a sect called the Donatists. And the Donatists were like the modern Catholic traditionalists or the Old Believer Russian Orthodox or the American Protestant fundamentalists. They were what you call rigorists. They were separatists, sectarians. And like every sectarian, of course, they're right. Everyone else is wrong. And this group, like these modern groups I just listed, group was causing a lot of tribulation in North Africa. And this eventually got the ear of Honorius and got the ear of the civil state, much like Arianism had done under the time of Constantine, or at the time of Constantine. And so, long story short, Marcellinus was martyred, as the Orthodox Christians would say, by the Donatist sectarians who had set him up. They had set him up, and he was executed by the state. And it is this man that the book, The City of God, is dedicated to. I say all of this simply, again, to lay out not just the pagan Christian amalgam that Augustine and Marcellinus and so forth had to wade through and sort through, but also the internal divisions amongst the Christians. Now that Christianity is on the rise, now it's going to have growing pains. And this is the age of the heresies, so-called, whether that's Arianism or Gnosticism or Donatism, Pelagianism, which Augustine will write against in Britain with a monk up there. So a very interesting time. And this is why the so-called Age of the Fathers is so revered in Christian memory of the Church Fathers, because they're not just digesting the Christian revelation, but they're also having to deal with very real-world dynamics of how do you apply these beliefs to real life and to real pastoral situations and even civil situations and political situations, like the barbarian onslaught at the very time that Rome becomes Christian. Okay, so let's hop into this article, The Purpose of History and the City of God. So, of course, when we're looking at the Civitas Dei, we also have the invitation to consider historiography. Now, this is something in a subsequent class at Apocatastasis that we're really diving into in a much deeper way than our open events. And that is our course on historical cycles entitled The Sons of Issachar. We just had our first session yesterday. It was a whirlwind, I'll tell you. 2 hours of historiography, and I'd have it no other way. When this old website decides to load, I'll show you the poster of that. But we got into, in the class, the differences and similarities in the perennialist or so-called pagan conception of time, which largely is cyclical because it's based on body rhythms and nature cycles and so forth. So, of course, this influences the historical perception. We'll let everything load up here. And then the Christian idea, well, I shouldn't say Christian, the Abrahamic idea of a linear understanding of history, because in the Torah, the New Testament, and the Quran, God reveals himself in historical events, sequentially and usually in a progressive fashion, right? So whether you're the time between Abraham and Ezekiel and David, or I should say Abraham and David, Ezekiel, Jesus, and Muhammad, the focus on who this entity, this God is, gets more and more refined. There's this so-called progressive revelation. And, okay, only took 10 years, and we're still waiting for it. Okay, there we go. That's what I wanted to show you all along. Right, this is the class. We're still taking students for this. The first class has gone in the history books, but we have plenty more to come. So the train is imminently leaving the station, but you can still hop on the caboose here. So if you want to sign up for this and really do a deep dive in historiography and historical cycles, there you go. But the point is, our first session looked at this, and actually, I say the Abrahamic conception of history is linear, and the pagan is cyclical. What becomes truly the Orthodox Christian understanding of history is more like a spring. I don't have my spring here. I used to have a convenient spring to illustrate this, but you know what a spring or a curly Q looks like, or a curly fry. I worked at Arby's myself for many years, a curly fry. Could use a few curly fries right now. But anyway, the Christian understanding is like that. So it revolves in a cycle, especially the liturgical cycle of the year, living out the life of Christ in the liturgy, literally ritualizing and praying through the life of Christ every single year, which is the whole cycle of the universe. Ultimately, we're coming up in the Western Church on the feast of Christ the King, Lord of the universe, right before Advent. It's a very eschatological feast. And it closes up the liturgical year, and then we merge right back into Advent. And that's not for nothing. It's not just a reset button, but there's a very deep reality there that the life of Christ in Palestine is the life of the universe. Anyway, that little cyclical aspect also eventually gets to, as the Christians believe, something called the parousia, or the second coming, as we say in English, and the recreation of the created order in the Christian mythology. The point is, all of this is to say that when we look at the Civitas Dei, Augustine isn't just doing an apologetical work, but also a historiographical work. He is going to set up and really concretize the Abrahamic/Christian idea of history being linear in a cyclical fashion at the same time. So let's hop into this again. All of these are just preliminary thoughts for our chit-chat hereafter. The purpose of history and the city of God. And I'm afraid the margins are not budging whatsoever. I can make this bigger, as I shall, but you will see the margins don't budge. And apparently I'm found out to be a liar. Okay. Well, while we're in the neighborhood, let's try our luck. All right. And I just want to check the tech before we dive into this piece. Okay. So, with that context in mind, oh, hold on, this is way down. Teleprompter free history, that's what you get here. There we go. Nope. Okay, when lists of the most influential theologians are imagined, Augustine usually sits near the pinnacle. He was amongst the tallest of theological giants, and his influence cannot be denied. His life story is well known due to his book, The Confessions. He excelled as a teacher of rhetoric and bounced between heretical sects and various philosophical schools. He battled against false teachers across the spectrum from both within and outside the church. And when the eternal city of Rome was sacked in 410, when women were treated brutally and shamefully, when many men were killed without discretion, when migrants from the war wandered across Italy, when Christianity was blamed for the catastrophe, Augustine answered brilliantly in the city of God. Throughout the city of God, Augustine lays out a vision of the purpose and end of history. Okay, right? So there we go. This is new, that there's a purpose to history and there's an end to history. Now, in our liberal days, we have kind of inherited aspects of this, secularized though they may be. But we have to understand, Augustine doesn't just invent the autobiography. He also invents this and really refines, or as I said before, concretizes this idea of history having a telos. And this, of course, will be the lowercase c, or k as the case may be, Catholic vision, that all of life fits into a single mold, a single divine mold. Even if it's, and even if we, or even if an empire like early pagan so-called Rome, doesn't even understand it. Augustine is really laying out this medieval vision, which is one of the reasons we might argue he is the first medieval. He is the first man to lay out the fact that all of human history fits into a single mold. Now, the Hebrews were the first to really play with this idea, and they would believe this to be revelation in their Torah and their Bible, but that vision was limited to the Hebrews. It remained for the Christians to take that vision and apply it to all of not just mankind, which was revolutionary itself, but also all of the created order, down to the natural rhythms. Everything fit into the plan of, as the Christians believe, the Trinity, the ultimate mystery of God for them. Augustine's overarching philosophy of human history is that it is all about the will and providence of God. All of it, every single human event. This is going to carry on into the medieval world. And believers are to devote themselves to studying, discerning, and praising and submitting to the eternal designs of God. The historical background. When considering what Augustine set out to do when he wrote the Civitas Dei, one must realize that he was not actually trying to write a historical account of the sacking of Rome or even its implications. He aimed to provide an overarching philosophical system of understanding history as a whole. So Augustine wasn't just doing history, he was doing historiography as well. He was applying philosophical structuring to the events of the past. Very classical, isn't it? To seek deeper meaning. Also very medieval. You know, there are many areas, which is why we have two designated time periods between medieval and the previous classical world. There are many things that make those proper, and we can get into that in this series and in our chit-chat hereafter. But there are also similarities. And one of those similarities, and whether it's the classical world or the medieval, often they both share a dissimilarity with modernity. And here's a big one. Whether you are a classical ancient person, so-called, or a medieval, you see meaning in everything. In a sense, one of the differences between the classical and the medieval is that the medieval sees meaning in a much deeper way because of things like Augustine's historiography and of the Christian message and so forth. The idea that, in Christianity, Jesus dies for everything in the universe. He redeems all of creation, not just mankind. Every animal, every plant, every rock, every star, etc., etc. So that, of course, widens the vision. And then it's refined by the likes of Augustine and his historiography. So that's a development and an increasing consciousness compared to the classical. Now, both of those, however, who see meaning in reality, are different, of course, than modernity, where we do not see meaning, we just see data, right? And so when we read the Civitas Dei, we have to understand these prejudices that the author, and that's the same will be true for Boethius next week, or the Quran, or yes, the Song of Roland, much later, when we look at the battle that encompasses. The point is, all of those people are coming from a world of meaning, and we, in our so-called postmodern West, do not have meaning. Augustine increases that meaning, and that analysis of meaning, in fact. Some come off a bit more disappointed. Quote, "My own conclusion is that whatever one may think of St. Augustine's religious faith as an expression of Christianity, it was and can still be disastrous for the study of history, considered as anything more than material for the elaboration of an edifying noble lie." That's from one modern scholar, and the author here says, ouch. Peter Barnes masterfully lays out the purpose for Augustine writing the City of God and how it fits in with his understanding of history. First, he points out that Augustine wrote this work after two major disappointments with the Roman Empire. First, as we talked about, the unjust execution of Marcellinus at the hands of the Donatists in 413, for whom books 1 through 3 of the City of God are dedicated. This led to Augustine having a bad taste in his mouth about justice in the state. Boethius will have a similar confrontation. Perhaps this helped fuel his famed quote, "What are kingdoms without justice? They're just gangs of bandits." Unquote. The second frustration for Augustine was after he convinced the Roman general Boniface to convert to the faith and leave civil life. Following this, Boniface was baptized by an Arian. No! Augustine then saw the issue that could arise when political officers hold heretical views. So beyond the Donatists, who were like the traditional Catholics of their day, these sectarian spin-offs, or the old believers, whatever. Foursquare Gospel, 39-point Episcopalians. I'm trying to think the different Protestant sects and their rigorists. The fundamentalist American Protestants, the evangelicals. Whatever the case, we know that type. Well, even within the Christian world, there was a much, much bigger problem than Donatism or just referencing and passing Pelagianism, but that was Arianism. Arianism was big enough to compete for the attention of the civil structure, and in fact was successful in wooing the civil structure successfully from time to time. Augustine saw in this situation with Boniface that the issue that indeed could arise when political officers hold heretical views. Historians differ in their opinion on how Augustine felt about the empire. Christopher Dawson, a Catholic author whom I referenced in the excellent essay, Catholics and the Bourgeois Mind. You must, I don't care what your religion is or your interest in philosophy or religion, to understand the middle class, you have to read that essay, Catholics and the Bourgeois Mind. Dawson argues that Augustine had no opinion on the issues of the empire at all, to the point that, quote, the ruin of civilization and the destruction of the empire were not very important things to him. Most, however, take the position that Augustine did care about the state, but it was not a major concern to him. Regardless of the degree to which Augustine cared about Rome, it is clear that his philosophy of history was not akin to ancient or modern historiography. Why? Well, maybe because he's medieval. Maybe. He was not concerned with writing history for the sake of a temporary empire, but rather he desired to view history through the lens of the kingdom of God. The easiest way to summarize Augustine's use of history in the City of God is that it, quote, basically is a presentation of Christianity in the form of biblical history from Genesis to Revelation. And to go from that lily pad to that lily pad, you have to come across intervening civilizations like Rome. That's where Augustine is also interesting in this burgeoning Catholic view of life. It's not just on an individual level, for instance, in the Christian paradigm, that, oh, non-Hebrews can be saved. God's going to work with non-Hebrews just as much as Hebrews. There's no distinction between Jew and Greek, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, Jew, slave, or free, as St. Paul says in Corinthians chapter 3, verse 11. It's not just that, but also empires like Rome can be saved, in a sense, or baptized, or whatever, used for God's plans, just as much. And even in modern Christianity, of whatever sect, that sounds strange. Very often, because of discourses that might require another open event series, very often in modern Christianity, Rome is interpreted in a negative light. That was not the case for Augustine. His fundamental thesis about the empire is that God blessed the empire with material success because the empire at one point, and more importantly, the citizens of the empire were virtuous. So God blessed virtue. And that's why the Romans kicked ass. That's why the Romans conquered the known world, because they were in their own, as he would say, darkened, misguided sense, but nevertheless, with some guidance in the dark, fumbling around, the Romans, with the graces they were given, so-called, the Romans were virtuous. They were aesthetical. They, at one point in their history, prior, I would say, to the Second Punic War, the Romans were a aesthetic, virtuous people. In time, luxury destroyed them. And that's fundamentally Augustine's thesis in the City of God, is that God blessed the empire because it was virtuous, at least naturally, with the so-called pagan virtues or the cardinal virtues. They can't be held to account for not having the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. Okay, fair enough. The Romans were, for pagans, virtuous. They had the cardinal virtues. They followed those up. They thought about them. They lived them, most importantly. And then they stopped. And so therefore God, this is Augustine's thesis, therefore God stopped blessing the Roman Empire. But in the big picture, God doesn't need the empire any more than he needs the Hebrews. Right? At a certain point in Christian mythology, the Hebrews lost their covenant with Yahweh. They stopped following Yahweh, and so the promises of the covenant, Deuteronomy, the chapters there with Moses, they stopped applying. Those are conditional promises. Sorry for all you Zionists and Rockefeller, Rothschilds people. The biblical promises to the bloodline Jews no longer apply because the bloodline Jews stopped following God. Likewise, Augustine says in the Civitas Dei, the Romans were blessed because they were virtuous. When they stopped being naturally virtuous, they stopped being blessed. Hence, me, Augustine, right, and just for fun, me, Augustine, writing this, everything's falling apart, but the bigger picture, and this is the vision, and this is going to carry on, I would argue, into the medieval age. The bigger vision is that God doesn't need the Roman Empire. God's ultimate history is going to come to pass. So there's a tremendous sublimation of the historical ideas of the Hebrews. In the books of Kings and Chronicles and Daniel and in other books as well of the Old Testament, there's a tremendous sublimation, a raising up of the vision of the Old Testament and of the New Testament to world empires when it comes to the City of God and the people of Rome. So there we go. These are just introductory remarks, after all. We can go much deeper, and we will in our chit-chat hereafter. So with that being said, just a reminder that the purpose of schools is to We'll provide a learning community and a scaffolding of knowledge. And all your AI bubbles in the world will not be able to provide for that, and all your so-called AI education will not be able to provide for that. So, with that consciousness, why don't you sign up and fork over some good donation money and join us for our next open event, especially if you're interested in enrolling at Apocatastasис. These open events are a great way to get a flavor of our teaching style, myself and the other presenters over the semesters. And even if you don't enroll, that's cool too, because you're working on your brain and you're joining a learning community. So there's never any pressure to join in any deeper sense. It's great just to have you on board. So anyhow, with all of this being said, if you're joining live, just hang on and we'll have our chit chat after a brief break. And the rest of you, get reading The City of God and get thinking about the philosophical aspects of history, including historical demarcations, ancient, medieval, modern, and whether or not Augustine is the first medieval. With that being said, thank you so much, and I'll catch you soon enough. Bye-bye.